The mysterious millionaire finally enters the magnificent dining room to taste her first meal, and she drops her serving spoon in shock. The reclusive man who hired her is the same one who left her pregnant with twins 4 years ago, his eyes still holding the same desperate love. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel, and let's get started. Natasha Williams's fingers trembled as she folded the last napkin, arranging it into a perfect swan atop the plate. The small table in the corner of the apartment was set with far more care than the polished oak tables she arranged daily at the Beacon, where Boston's elite came to see and be seen. Tonight was different. Tonight was for them alone. She stepped back, surveying her work. The candles, the wine chilling in the ice bucket, the delicate china she'd found at a second-hand shop that didn't look second-hand at all. The aroma of jerk chicken with a French reduction sauce filled the apartment, a culinary marriage that represented everything about their unlikely relationship. Natasha checked her phone again. 6:45. Alexander would arrive at 7, always punctual despite his family's reputation for making others wait. 2 years of loving him had taught her his rhythms, his preferences, the small tells that separated Alexander Huntington III, heir to the Huntington fortune, from the Alexander who kissed her forehead while they cooked together on Sunday mornings. Just a few more minutes, she whispered to herself, pressing a hand against her still flat stomach. The pregnancy test, all 3 of them, had been clear. After tonight, everything would change. She'd imagined his reaction countless times. Surprise giving way to joy, perhaps concern about timing, but ultimately, happiness. They loved each other. This baby would bridge their separate worlds permanently. The knock came at 7 sharp. Natasha smoothed her dress, simple but elegant, purchased with tips saved over 3 weeks, and opened the door with a smile that faltered as soon as she saw his face. Alexander? He kissed her cheek, a cool brush of lips that felt nothing like his usual embraces. His eyes, those penetrating blue eyes that had first noticed her across the Beacon's dining room, wouldn't quite meet hers. "Something smells amazing," he said, but the compliment lacked warmth. Dinner progressed with a strange formality. Alexander spoke about the weather, about a business trip to Chicago, about everything except the tension hanging between them. Natasha answered mechanically, her planned announcement dying on her lips each time she tried to speak it. When she finally placed the dessert, a rum-soaked cake with caramelized pineapple, before him, she could wait no longer. "I have something to tell you," she said, her Jamaican accent, usually subdued through years of careful practice, emerging slightly with her nervousness. Alexander looked up, finally meeting her eyes. Something like resignation crossed his face. "I'm pregnant," Natasha said, the words hanging in the air between them. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Alexander's knuckles whitened around his fork. "A baby?" His voice was hollow. "You're sure?" Natasha nodded, confusion replacing the joy she'd rehearsed. "Yes, I took 3 tests." Alexander set down his fork with deliberate care. "This wasn't in the plans, Natasha." His expression hardened, becoming the face he wore in newspaper photographs beside his father, the senator. "This can't be happening." "But it is happening," she said, her voice small. I thought you'd be happy." "Happy?" He laughed, a harsh sound she'd never heard from him before. "This complicates everything. My family's expectations, my future at Huntington Industries." "What about us?" Natasha interrupted. "What about our future?" Alexander stood abruptly. "I need time to think. This is too much right now." He left without touching the dessert, without kissing her goodbye, without another word about the life growing inside her. Natasha sat alone at the perfect table setting until the candles burned down to stubs, her untouched dessert melting slowly before her. The week that followed was the longest of Natasha's life. Her calls went straight to voicemail. Her texts showed as delivered but unread. At the Beacon, she watched from the service area as Alexander dined with his family, laughing with his mother as if nothing had changed, as if Natasha and their child didn't exist at all. On the 8th day, when she'd almost given up hope, he returned to the apartment. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "You've made your decision," she said, not asking. Alexander stood in the entryway, not bothering to remove his coat. "This was never going to work long-term, Natasha. We both knew that." "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I didn't know that. I thought when you said you loved me, you meant it." "I did. I do," he said, but his eyes shifted away. "But love isn't always enough. My family would never accept someone like you." The words hit Natasha like physical blows. Someone like me? A waitress without formal education, the daughter of Jamaican immigrants. He spoke clinically, as if discussing a business proposal. "You would be a burden to the Huntington legacy. The board would never take me seriously with a wife who served their dinner last month." Natasha felt something inside her harden, a protective shell forming around her heart, around her womb. "We're talking about your child, Alexander." "Be reasonable," he said, placing an envelope on the small table where they'd shared so many meals. "There's enough money here for 3 months' rent and to resolve the situation. It's better this way. You'll understand that we're not from the same world." Natasha didn't touch the envelope. "Get out! Natasha, get outside!" Alexander hesitated, then turned toward the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "I've left a note explaining everything. I really am sorry." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the stairwell, each one driving home the reality of her situation. Alone, pregnant, abandoned. Natasha stood frozen until the sound of his expensive car engine faded into the distance. Only then did she approach the envelope, opening it with trembling fingers. Inside was a check for an amount that made her gasp, along with a coldly worded note. "This is the best solution for everyone concerned. I trust you'll make the practical decision. A." She crumpled the note but kept the check. Not for the purpose he intended, never for that, but because she would need every resource available to survive what was coming. From the window of the apartment, an apartment she now realized had always been kept separate from his real life, Natasha watched Alexander's luxury car pull away. His posture behind the wheel was relaxed, as if he'd just concluded a mildly unpleasant business meeting rather than destroyed someone's life. "I will never need you," she whispered, one hand pressing against her belly. "We will never need a man who thought we were unworthy of his precious name." The following days blurred together. Natasha worked her shifts at the Beacon, serving champagne to women who wore single earrings worth more than her annual salary, smiling through morning sickness that left her dizzy in the restaurant's gleaming bathrooms. During her break, she huddled in the staff room, staring at the pregnancy test she'd brought to work, not because she doubted the result, but because she needed the physical reminder that she wasn't dreaming this nightmare. The tiny blue plus sign stared back at her, indifferent to how it had changed everything. Her phone chimed with a news alert, something she'd set up long ago to track Alexander's public appearances. There he was, smiling at a charity gala, his arm around Victoria Chambers, the senator's daughter whose family had summered with the Huntingtons since childhood. The caption read, "Huntington heir back on the social scene after mysterious absence. Sources suggest a European sabbatical for the future CEO." Natasha laughed bitterly. His mysterious absence had been the 2 years he'd spent building a life with her in the shadows. His sabbatical had been their love story, now apparently concluded and forgotten. She turned off the alerts. There would be no more tracking Alexander Huntington. From now on, she would focus solely on survival, for herself and for the child who would never know how easily their father had walked away. While watching his car disappear around the corner, Natasha couldn't possibly imagine that one day her image would fill billboards across Boston, and Alexander Huntington III would face the most difficult choice of his life when seeing her again. The tiny blue plus sign stared back at her, indifferent to how it had changed everything. As days turned into weeks, Natasha's reality transformed with the growing life inside her. What had begun as morning sickness evolved into a constant companion, a reminder of both the child she would protect and the man who had walked away. On a crisp October morning, Natasha sat alone in the Massachusetts General Hospital waiting room, arms wrapped protectively around her still small belly. Around her, other expectant mothers chatted excitedly with partners or scrolled through baby name websites. The empty chair beside her might as well have had a spotlight on it. Williams? Natasha Williams? The ultrasound technician's voice echoed across the waiting area. Natasha rose, smoothing her second-hand maternity dress, feeling the judgment in the eyes that followed her. A young woman, clearly alone, no ring on her finger. She lifted her chin higher, refusing to be diminished by their assumptions. The technician, a woman with kind eyes and practiced neutrality, squirted cold gel onto Natasha's exposed abdomen. "First pregnancy?" she asked, moving the wand in practiced circles. "Yes," Natasha answered, her Jamaican accent slightly more pronounced with nervousness. "Do you want to know the gender if I can tell?" "Yes, please." The technician's movements slowed, her brow furrowing slightly as she adjusted the wand, pressing it more firmly against Natasha's skin. "Is something wrong?" Natasha asked, fear clutching at her throat. No, the technician reassured her quickly. "Just confirming something." She turned the screen, pointing to two distinct shapes, two fluttering heartbeats. "Congratulations, Ms. Williams. You're having twins." The word echoed in the small examination room. Twins, two babies, two of Alexander's children, twice the responsibility, twice the joy, twice the challenge. Tears spilled down Natasha's cheeks, falling silently onto the paper-covered examination table. The technician, misreading her reaction, squeezed her shoulder. "It's a lot to take in, I know. Would you like me to call someone for you?" Natasha shook her head, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. There's no one to call. Later that evening, Natasha sat at the kitchen table in the Beacon Hill apartment, calculator in hand, bills spread before her. The numbers wouldn't balance no matter how she arranged them. Two babies meant double everything: diapers, clothes, food. The 3 months of rent Alexander had generously provided would barely cover the hospital bills not picked up by her limited insurance. Her phone chimed with a text from her manager at the Beacon. "Need to see you before your shift tomorrow. Come early." Natasha knew what was coming even before she stepped into the manager's office the next day. Alan Peterson, always uncomfortable with direct confrontation, shuffled papers on his desk before finally meeting her eyes. "Natasha, you've been a great employee, but—" He gestured vaguely at her now visible pregnancy. "The owner feels your current condition doesn't align with the image we want to project to our clientele." "My condition," Natasha repeated flatly. "You mean my pregnancy?" Alan winced. "We're willing to provide a reference, and 2 weeks severance, which is generous considering—" "Considering what?" Natasha interrupted, her voice steel-edged but controlled. "Considering I've never been late, never called out sick, and have regular customers who request my section?" "It's not personal," Alan said, the standard refuge of those delivering entirely personal blows. "It's business." Natasha stood, gathering her dignity like armor. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Peterson. I'll collect my things." As she packed her small locker in the employee area, Natasha caught sight of herself in the mirror, the dark circles under her eyes, the slight swell of her belly under her uniform. "You would be a burden to the Huntington legacy," Alexander had said. His words followed her like ghosts. The unemployment office was crowded with desperation. Natasha took a number and waited, watching a young mother struggling to quiet a fussing infant while filling out forms. Soon that would be her, but doubled. The thought terrified and strengthened her simultaneously. When her number was finally called, the caseworker barely looked up from her computer. Employment history? Waitress at the Beacon, 4 years. Before that, hostess at Marino's Italian, 2 years. Reason for termination? Natasha hesitated. They said my pregnancy doesn't align with their image. Now the caseworker looked up, assessing Natasha's lack of wedding ring before returning to her screen. That's potentially illegal, but fighting it would take months. You need a job now, I imagine. By the end of November, Natasha had cobbled together 2 jobs: morning cleaning at a corporate building downtown and evening cashiering at a grocery store in Dorchester. Between shifts, she searched for cheaper apartments, the Beacon Hill rent impossible to maintain on her drastically reduced income. The small studio she found in Dorchester was a far cry from the charming apartment Alexander had provided. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing, the water ran rust-colored for several seconds before clearing, and sirens served as nightly lullabies. But it was what she could afford, and it was hers alone. Moving day was a study in humiliation. With no car and limited funds for movers, Natasha had carefully selected what she could take: clothing, a few kitchen essentials, the second-hand dishes that had once seemed so elegant. The rest, including the bed she and Alexander had shared, she sold online for a fraction of their worth. Her new neighbors watched curiously as she directed the discount moving service, her pregnancy now impossible to hide at 5 months. Their gazes held varying degrees of judgment, pity, and the universal assessment of a woman alone. That night, sitting on a second-hand mattress on the floor of her new home, Natasha counted coins for the laundromat, calculating how many loads she could afford. A pharmacy flyer caught her eye. Prenatal vitamins on sale, but still more than she could spare after rent and utilities. Food or vitamins? She asked her belly, a question no expectant mother should have to consider. December brought bitter cold and an unexpected gift. The clinic provided a month's supply of prenatal vitamins through a donation program. The doctor, noticing Natasha's worn coat and calculated questions about which tests were absolutely necessary, also connected her with a community support program for expectant mothers. In the clinic's waiting room, Natasha flipped through an abandoned magazine, freezing when she saw Alexander's face smiling back at her. He stood arm in arm with Victoria Chambers at a charity gala, both radiant in designer evening wear. The caption read, "Huntington heir announces engagement. Future CEO promises to uphold family traditions." Natasha traced his face with her fingertip, noticing how relaxed he appeared, how completely untroubled by the lives he had abandoned. The headline might as well have read, "Man who offered abortion money to waitress girlfriend continues privileged existence uninterrupted." At home, Natasha transformed cardboard boxes into makeshift cribs, lining them with donated blankets and sewing scrap fabric into small mattresses. She arranged them beside her bed, adding touches of color with paper decorations cut from magazines. "It's not much," she told her swelling belly, "but it's made with love." January brought record snowfall and increasingly difficult commutes. Natasha's feet swelled painfully in boots that no longer fit properly, but new ones weren't in the budget. At the cleaning job, bending to scrub floors and toilets became an exercise in determination as her pregnancy advanced. One particularly brutal night, as she trudged home through 8 inches of fresh snow, a sharp pain doubled her over. She grabbed a lamppost for support, breathing through the contraction as panic rose in her chest. It was too early, barely 32 weeks. "Please, not yet," she whispered to her belly. "Just a little longer." The contractions continued as she flagged down a reluctant taxi, the driver eyeing her warily. "You're not gonna have those babies in my cab, are you?" he asked, only half joking. "Hospital," Natasha managed between breaths. "Massachusetts General, please hurry." As the taxi navigated slippery streets, Natasha pressed her hand to her belly, making a solemn promise to the lives within. "I'll do everything for you to never need anything, much less the man who rejected us." Marcus and Maya were born small but healthy, arriving just before midnight in a flurry of medical activity. When the nurse placed them in Natasha's arms, tiny, perfect faces with Alexander's blue eyes. The magnitude of her responsibility crashed over her like a wave. "Hello, my loves," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's just us three now, but that's all we need." 3 days later, Natasha brought her twins home to the tiny Dorchester apartment, settling them into their cardboard cribs lined with donated blankets. As they slept, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect synchrony, she stood over them, memorizing every detail of their perfect faces. "You will never need a man who considered us unworthy of his precious name," she vowed softly. "One day, all the Huntingtons in Boston will know what they lost." The months that followed tested Natasha's limits. Sleep became a luxury between feedings, her body still recovering as she returned to work far too soon. In the pre-dawn hours while the twins slept, she used the public library's internet to study culinary techniques, printing recipes to practice with the few ingredients she could afford. "The kitchen will be our salvation," she whispered to her sleeping babies, testing flavor combinations and techniques that would one day become her signature. Each small success in the kitchen fueled her determination. A perfect sauce, a balanced spice blend, flavors that told the story of her heritage and her future. While rocking her babies to sleep in that tiny apartment, Natasha couldn't possibly imagine that her image would one day fill billboards across Boston, and Alexander Huntington III would face the most difficult choice of his life when seeing her again. While rocking her babies to sleep in that tiny apartment, Natasha couldn't possibly imagine that her image would one day fill billboards across Boston, and Alexander Huntington III would face the most difficult choice of his life when seeing her again. 4 years passed like seasons in a garden, harsh winters of struggle giving way to tentative springs of possibility. Natasha no longer measured time by hours or days, but by the milestones of her twins. First words, first steps, first questions that required careful answers. The cardboard cribs had long since been replaced by second-hand toddler beds. The tiny Dorchester apartment transformed from a shelter of necessity into something resembling a home. "Mama, look!" Maya held up a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures, taller one in the middle, smaller ones on each side, all holding hands. "It's us!" Natasha kissed her daughter's forehead, marveling at the perfect curl pattern that mirrored her own. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. We'll put it right on the refrigerator." Marcus, quieter but equally determined, concentrated on building a tower with mismatched blocks found at various yard sales. His blue eyes, so startlingly like his father's, narrowed in concentration, a small dimple appearing in his cheek when he succeeded. These quiet morning moments were precious, soon to be interrupted by the familiar rush to Mrs. Peterson's community daycare 3 blocks away. Natasha had found stability, of a sort, working as a line cook at Felipe's, a family-owned restaurant in South End. The owner, an older Puerto Rican man who recognized raw talent, had taken a chance on her despite her lack of formal training. "You have magic in your hands," he'd told her after tasting her sample dishes during the interview. "School teaches technique, but that sense for flavor? That comes from the soul." For 2 years, she had worked her way up from prep cook to leading the kitchen on slow weeknights. Her Caribbean-influenced specials had developed a small but loyal following, customers who specifically came on Natasha nights to taste what she'd created from Felipe's modest pantry. The pay wasn't much, enough to cover rent, childcare, and basics with little left over, but the hours allowed her to drop off and pick up the twins herself, to be present for dinner and bedtime stories. These were luxuries she hadn't dared hope for during those first desperate months. "Time to go, my loves," Natasha called, packing lunches into small backpacks decorated with library stickers. "Mrs. Peterson is waiting." The walk to the daycare past storefronts both shuttered and struggling, past corners where men loitered despite the early hour. Natasha held her children's hands tightly, nodding politely to familiar faces while keeping a vigilant eye for trouble. "Good morning, Natasha. And how are my favorite little ones today?" Mrs. Peterson greeted them at the door of her converted first-floor apartment, a sanctuary of bright colors and worn toys where neighborhood children gathered while parents worked. "Mama made pancakes shaped like stars," Marcus announced solemnly. "Did she now? What a lucky boy you are." Mrs. Peterson winked at Natasha. "Don't forget we close early today. Staff meeting at the community center." "I'll be here by 4, Natasha promised, crouching to hug her children goodbye. "Be good, learn something new, and remember, we're the brightest stars in the sky," the twins finished in unison, their practiced response bringing a smile to Natasha's tired face. The kitchen at Felipe's was already bustling when she arrived, prep cooks chopping vegetables and marinating meats for the lunch service. Natasha tied her apron with practiced efficiency, exchanging quick greetings as she reviewed the day's specials. "Natasha," Felipe called from the office. "Come, sit. Coffee?" She accepted the chipped mug, wariness creeping up her spine. Felipe rarely invited personal conversations during prep time. "My nephew is taking over more of the business," he began, confirming her fears. "He wants to go in a different direction, more traditional menu, family recipes only." Natasha's hands tightened around the mug. "You're letting me go." No. Felipe shook his head vigorously. "But he's cutting hours for non-family. I can only offer 3 shifts a week now. I fought for more, believe me." 3 shifts, less than half her current income. The mental calculations began immediately. Which bills could be delayed, what expenses could be cut, how long until eviction became a threat again. "I understand," she said, because what else could she say? "Thank you for fighting for me." Felipe looked genuinely pained. "You deserve better, Natasha. Your food brings people through our doors. My nephew is a fool. When does this start?" "Next week. I'm sorry. I only just found out myself." Natasha nodded, already planning her next move. "Then let's make this week's specials memorable." That afternoon, when she arrived at the daycare, the usual calm of Mrs. Peterson's was disrupted by excited chatter. Parents clustered around the community bulletin board, speaking in hushed, hopeful tones. "Natasha, have you seen this?" Mrs. Peterson waved her over, pointing to a freshly posted notice in elegant cream cardstock. "It seems almost too good to be true." The notice, printed on paper thicker than anything Natasha typically encountered, read, "Position available, private chef for Oakwood Residence, Brookline. Experience in fine dining desirable. Family accommodation provided on property. Competitive salary. Inquire with references and sample menu proposal." Below the text was a phone number and email address, with Residence Oakwood as the only identifier. "Brookline," one mother whispered. "That's where the mansions are. Imagine living in a place like that." Natasha studied the notice, doubt clouding her initial spark of interest. Brookline was indeed where old money lived. Sprawling estates behind iron gates, a world as distant from Dorchester as the moon. A world where people like Alexander belonged. "It's not for someone like me," she said softly, echoing words that had scarred her heart years ago. Mrs. Peterson clicked her tongue. "And why not? Your food is better than half the restaurants downtown. Those rich folks would be lucky to have you." "Mama, we learned about butterflies today." Maya's voice broke through Natasha's hesitation as the twins bounded over. Later that night, after bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, Natasha sat at her small kitchen table with a notepad. 3 shifts at Felipe's wouldn't cover rent. The daycare costs alone would eat most of that income. Without a second job, they'd be back where they started 4 years ago, desperate and sinking. The cream-colored notice folded carefully in her pocket all day now lay before her. Family accommodation provided, competitive salary. The words shimmered with possibility. With steady hands, she began drafting a sample menu, combining the classical techniques she'd studied in borrowed library books with the Caribbean flavors of her heritage. Simple ingredients elevated by precise technique, each dish telling a story of resilience and transformation. 2 days later, dressed in her only good outfit, a navy dress purchased from a consignment shop for interviews, Natasha stood before the imposing gates of Oakwood residence. The property stretched beyond her field of vision, ancient oaks lining a winding driveway that disappeared into carefully manicured grounds. The elderly woman who answered the service entrance had the rigid posture and assessing gaze of someone who had managed grand households for decades. "Mrs. Hartford," she introduced herself, neither warm nor cold. "The housekeeper. You're here about the chef position." It wasn't a question. Natasha followed her through service corridors into a kitchen that made her breath catch. Gleaming copper pots hanging above a 6-burner professional range, marble countertops stretching the length of the room, a walk-in refrigerator visible through a partially open door. "The master has very specific requirements," Mrs. Hartford explained. "He rarely leaves his quarters due to health concerns. Meals are to be prepared and left in the dining room. You are not to disturb him or attempt conversation." "I understand," Natasha said, though she didn't. What kind of person hired staff they never intended to see? "You mentioned children in your application. How many?" "Twins, 4 years old." Mrs. Hartford nodded once. "The guest house has 3 bedrooms. It would be suitable. Now, I'd like to see what you can do with limited ingredients and time. The refrigerator is stocked. Prepare something simple but representative of your abilities." Alone in the magnificent kitchen, Natasha took a deep breath and opened the refrigerator. Basic ingredients stared back at her: eggs, butter, arborio rice, white wine, parmesan, fresh herbs, the makings of a simple risotto. She worked methodically, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of cooking. The soft sizzle of shallots in butter, the distinct sound of wine reducing, the gradual incorporation of hot stock into rice. She added a twist of her own, a subtle infusion of thyme and lemon zest, a technique that elevated the humble dish to something memorable. When Hartford returned, Natasha presented a perfectly executed risotto, creamy yet with each grain distinct, finished with a light dusting of aged parmesan. The housekeeper took one bite, then another. Something flickered across her stoic face, a memory perhaps, or recognition of a time when food had brought joy rather than mere sustenance. "When can you start?" she asked, her voice slightly softer than before. "Immediately," Natasha answered, hope rising in her chest. "My children can move in this weekend. The salary is as discussed, with room and board included. The master is very particular about breakfast. He expects it at 7:30 precisely." As Natasha walked back through the imposing gates, contract in hand, she felt a strange mixture of triumph and trepidation. The guest house alone was larger than any home she'd ever occupied. The salary would allow her to start a savings account for the twins' education. For the first time in 4 years, security seemed within reach. "It's like a castle, Mama," Maya exclaimed that weekend, racing through the guest house with uncontained excitement. Watching her children explore rooms with actual windows and space to play, Natasha felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. On Monday morning, determined to impress her mysterious employer, she prepared her signature breakfast: waffles with blueberry compote and caramelized bacon, the same meal she used to make for Alexander on lazy Sunday mornings during happier times. As she arranged the tray with fresh flowers from the garden, Mrs. Hartford's instructions echoed in her mind. "Leave the meal and withdraw. The master prefers to dine alone." Natasha placed the tray on the massive oak dining table, admiring the craftsmanship of the room. Photographs on the mantelpiece caught her attention, but before she could examine them, footsteps approached from the hallway. Against instructions, she remained, wanting feedback on her first meal. The dining room door opened slowly. A man entered, leaning heavily on a cane. Thinner, with visible scars across his face, but unmistakable, Alexander Huntington III, the man who had abandoned her pregnant 4 years earlier. The serving spoon slipped from Natasha's fingers, clattering against the marble floor with an echoing crash that matched the shattering of her world. "Natasha?" His voice was a disbelieving whisper. Before she could respond, cheerful voices broke the frozen moment. Marcus and Maya ran into the room, stopping beside Natasha. "Mama, can we play in the garden later?" Marcus asked, his blue eyes, identical to Alexander's, shining with anticipation. Alexander gripped the table for support, his gaze darting between the twins and Natasha, painful comprehension dawning across his scarred face. While observing Alexander from the kitchen window, interacting timidly with the twins in the garden, Natasha didn't imagine that in less than a year they would all be together in a courtroom, facing the power of Senator Huntington in a confrontation that would change the political landscape of Massachusetts. Alexander gripped the table for support, his gaze darting between the twins and Natasha, painful comprehension dawning across his scarred face. The moment stretched between them, taut as a wire, heavy with 4 years of absence and unanswered questions. Natasha instinctively stepped in front of her children, a protective barrier between them and the man who had once discarded them all. "Children, go back to the house and finish your breakfast," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. "Mama needs to speak with the employer." Maya tugged at her brother's sleeve. "Come on, Marcus. Mrs. Hartford said she'd show us the bird feeders." As if summoned by her name, the elderly housekeeper appeared in the doorway, her stoic expression betraying only the slightest flicker of understanding as she surveyed the tableau before her. Without a word, she extended her hands to the children, who followed her from the room with curious backward glances. When the door closed behind them, Alexander collapsed into the nearest chair, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the twins had stood. The cane clattered to the floor, forgotten. "They're mine?" The words emerged as a pained whisper. "Yes." Natasha's response cut through the air like a blade. "Marcus and Maya, 4 years old, the children you suggested I resolve the situation with." Alexander covered his face with his hands, his shoulders trembling visibly. "I never knew, never imagined. You never asked." Natasha remained standing, rigid, years of contained anger flowing through her voice. "You disappeared, Alexander. Left me alone, pregnant, without resources. Natasha, please, you need to hear me out." Alexander raised his gaze, revealing eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't what you think. I'm not interested in what you think or don't think anymore." She bent to retrieve the fallen spoon, a mechanical movement to hide the tremor in her hands. "I'll submit my resignation immediately." "No!" The urgency in his voice startled her. "Please, you have every right to hate me, but you need to know the truth. Afterward, if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Natasha hesitated, torn between the desire to flee with her children and a burning need to understand what had happened. "You have 5 minutes." Alexander struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the table. "Not here. In the library. There are things you need to see." She followed him, maintaining a careful distance, noting how his once confident stride had been reduced to a painful limp. The Alexander she had known, tall, athletic, untouchable, had been replaced by this diminished figure, bearing scars both visible and hidden. The library was exactly what she would have expected of a Huntington estate: floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, the smell of old money and privilege. Alexander approached a painting on the far wall, swinging it aside to reveal a concealed safe. "After the accident, I had everything moved here," he explained, fingers trembling slightly as he worked the combination. "Away from my father's reach." The safe door swung open, revealing stacks of documents, folders, and what appeared to be recording devices. Alexander withdrew several files, spreading their contents across the massive desk that dominated the center of the room. "My father discovered our relationship 2 weeks before I left you," he began, voice hollow with remembered pain. "Not through me. Through private investigators he kept on retainer to monitor potential liabilities to the family name." He pushed a folder toward her. Inside were surveillance photos. Natasha entering their apartment building, the two of them walking together in the public garden, Intimate moments that had felt private but clearly weren't. He called me to his study that night, showed me these, along with this. Alexander slid another document across the desk. Natasha's breath caught as she recognized the file, detailed information about her parents, their immigration status, their jobs, even the address of her aunt in Jamaica. He threatened to destroy your life, Natasha, to put you on blacklists so you could never find work in Massachusetts, to ensure you'd be evicted from any apartment, even to have your parents' immigration status reviewed. Natasha's fingers traced over the document, noting the precision of the details, the clinical assessment of vulnerabilities that could be exploited. So you chose to protect yourself instead. I thought I was protecting you, Alexander insisted, his voice cracking. I believed if I cut ties completely, he would leave you alone. I never knew you were pregnant. I swear on my life, Natasha, if I had known— You would have what? She challenged, anger flaring anew. Defied your father? Chosen us over your inheritance? I find that hard to believe. Alexander reached for another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings, medical reports, police statements. 2 years ago, I finally confronted him. After years of feeling dead inside, I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I knew what he'd done, that I would expose every dirty secret, every corrupt deal, unless he told me where to find you. The medical reports showed catastrophic injuries, compound fractures, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury. The newspaper article carried the headline, Huntington heir in critical condition after highway accident. 2 days after I threatened him, my brakes failed on the expressway. Alexander's voice was flat, emotionless. The investigation was inconclusive. Mechanical failure, they said. But we both know there are no coincidences in the Huntington family. Natasha sank into a chair, the weight of his words pressing upon her. Your father tried to kill you? He tried to silence me. Death would have been an unfortunate but acceptable outcome. Alexander's bitter laugh held no humor. Instead, I spent 6 months in hospitals and rehabilitation, then retreated here to Oakwood, property in my mother's family name, beyond his immediate control. Why should I believe any of this? Natasha asked, though the evidence before her was compelling. I'm not asking you to believe me. Alexander's gaze met hers directly for the first time. I'm asking you to stay long enough to get to know our children. They deserve more than an absent father, even if I don't deserve to be their father. Natasha remained silent, processing the revelations before her. The Alexander who had abandoned her was calculating, cold, concerned only with appearances and family legacy. This man before her seemed broken, humbled by pain and regret. I need time to think, she finally said. And ground rules. The children are my priority. Of course, he agreed quickly. Whatever you need. I'll continue as chef for now. The arrangement benefits my children. That's my only consideration. She stood, straightening her spine. But we're not a family, Alexander. You don't get to waltz into their lives and play father after 4 years of absence. I understand. His acceptance was immediate, without protest. Would it be permitted for me to interact with them, without revealing who I am yet? The vulnerability in his question caught her off guard. She had expected demands, not requests. They believe you're my employer. We can maintain that story while I decide what's best. In the days that followed, an uneasy truce settled over Oakwood. Natasha continued preparing meals, now with the knowledge of who would be eating them. She watched cautiously as Alexander began tentative interactions with the twins, building pillow forts in the great room, reading stories in the garden, teaching Marcus the basic moves of chess. To her surprise, he was gentle and attentive, never overstepping the boundaries she had established, always seeking her approval with a glance before offering the children anything. This consideration was so at odds with the man who had coldly dismissed her 4 years earlier that she struggled to reconcile the two versions. One evening, while observing from the kitchen window as Alexander patiently showed Maya how to feed the birds without startling them, Mrs. Hartford appeared silently beside her. "In 2 years, I never saw him smile before you arrived," the housekeeper said quietly. "He was like a ghost in this house. Now there's life again." Natasha turned, startled by the personal observation from the usually reserved woman. "People change when it suits them." "Some do," Mrs. Hartford acknowledged. "Others change because they've been broken and put back together differently." She nodded toward Alexander, who was laughing at something Maya had said. "That's not a man playing a role, Ms. Williams. That's a man discovering something he thought was lost forever." As autumn progressed, Natasha found herself reluctantly noting changes in Alexander beyond the physical. The arrogance had been replaced by humility, the entitlement by gratitude for small kindnesses. When he asked permission to gift the twins with educational books, carefully respecting her authority as their mother, she felt the first hairline crack in the wall she had built around her heart. While observing Alexander from the kitchen window, interacting timidly with the twins in the garden, Natasha didn't imagine that in less than a year they would all be together in a courtroom, facing the power of Senator Huntington in a confrontation that would change the political landscape of Massachusetts. While observing Alexander from the kitchen window interacting timidly with the twins in the garden, Natasha didn't imagine that in less than a year they would all be together in a courtroom, facing the power of Senator Huntington in a confrontation that would change the political landscape of Massachusetts. As October gave way to November, a cautious routine established itself at Oakwood. Each morning, Natasha prepared breakfast for Alexander and the twins, watching with conflicted emotions as they gradually began sharing the main dining table rather than eating separately. The first time Marcus had asked Alexander to help with a particularly stubborn juice box, something twisted painfully in her chest, a mixture of protective instinct and reluctant recognition that her son deserved male guidance she couldn't provide. From the kitchen doorway, Natasha observed Alexander carefully unfolding the chess set on the library table, Marcus climbing into the chair opposite him with serious concentration. "The knight moves in an L shape," Alexander explained, demonstrating with gentle hands. "2 spaces one way, then 1 space sideways." Marcus's face scrunched in concentration. "Like a puzzle." "Exactly like a puzzle. Chess is all about thinking ahead, planning your moves." Natasha retreated silently, unsure why the simple interaction affected her so deeply. Perhaps because it was precisely the scene she had imagined during pregnancy, Alexander teaching their son with patience and pride. A scene she had forced herself to forget was possible. That evening, while preparing dinner, she heard Maya's delighted laughter echoing from the conservatory. Drawn by the unfamiliar sound, Maya was typically the more reserved twin. Natasha peered through the doorway to find Alexander sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by pillows, performing elaborate animal impressions while telling a story. "And then the elephant said," Alexander raised his arm like a trunk, his voice comically deep, "I never forget a face, especially one as silly as yours." Maya's laughter bubbled up again, uninhibited and pure. Natasha couldn't remember the last time she'd heard her daughter laugh like that. Not the polite giggles she offered adults, but genuine, abandoned mirth. Later that night, as Natasha sliced vegetables for the next day's meal, Mrs. Hartford entered the kitchen carrying a stack of linens. "May I?" The housekeeper gestured to the chair opposite Natasha. "Of course." Natasha wiped her hands, surprised by the request. Mrs. Hartford had maintained professional distance since their arrival, efficient but reserved. "You were crying earlier," the older woman stated matter-of-factly. "In the pantry. I heard you." Natasha stiffened. "I wasn't. It's not my place to pry," Mrs. Hartford continued, folding napkins with practiced precision. "But in 2 years I never saw him smile before you arrived. He was like a ghost haunting these rooms. Now there's life again." The simple observation pierced Natasha's carefully maintained defenses. "I don't know what you want me to say." "Nothing at all." Mrs. Hartford rose, her task completed. Only that pain changes people, sometimes for the worse, sometimes not. She paused at the doorway. And children have a way of seeing truth that adults have forgotten how to recognize. The next morning, Alexander approached Natasha as she cleared breakfast dishes, his expression tentative. "I've been thinking," he began, leaning slightly on his cane. "About your education." Natasha tensed. "What about it?" "Before everything happened, you talked about culinary school, about formal training." The memory stung, dreams shared during intimate moments, plans whispered in the dark that had dissolved like morning mist. "That was a long time ago." "But you still love cooking," Alexander persisted. "I can taste it in every meal you prepare. Your talent deserves recognition, development." He placed several brochures on the counter. Natasha recognized the prestigious logos immediately. Le Cordon Bleu, the Cambridge School of Culinary Arts, Boston University's gastronomy program. "What is this?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Options," Alexander replied simply. "Night classes, weekend intensives. Mrs. Hartford has already agreed to watch the twins whenever needed. I would cover all expenses, of course." Natasha's defenses flared. "I don't need your charity." "Not charity," he corrected quietly. "Restitution, perhaps. Or investment in the mother of my children, or simply the right thing to do. Choose whichever reason lets you accept." That evening, alone in the guest house, Natasha spread the brochures across the small dining table, calculating costs that had once seemed insurmountable. Tuition alone at Le Cordon Bleu was more than she had earned in a year at Felipe's. Even with Alexander covering expenses, the time commitment seemed impossible with 2 young children. Yet as she flipped through course descriptions, something long dormant awakened within her. Ambition, passion, the hunger to create that had sustained her through darkest times. In borrowed library books and late-night internet searches, she had pieced together techniques and theories. Formal training would transform her intuitive talents into professional skills. 2 weeks later, Natasha attended her first evening class at Le Cordon Bleu, nervous among younger, more privileged students who had not spent the day cooking for others before arriving. To her surprise, the instructor, a formidable Frenchwoman with exacting standards, singled out her knife technique for praise. "You have worked in kitchens before," Chef Moreau observed. "It shows in your efficiency. But now we will refine that natural talent, yes?" Returning to Oakwood that night, Natasha found Alexander in the library, reading to the twins already in pajamas, their small bodies curled trustingly against him on the massive leather sofa. The scene, so domestic, so normal, stopped her in the doorway. "Mama!" Maya spotted her first. "Mr. Alexander does all the different voices." "Does he?" Natasha managed, meeting Alexander's questioning gaze over their daughter's head. The slight nod she offered seemed to release tension from his shoulders. As autumn gave way to winter, Natasha found herself noticing the small ways Alexander had inserted himself into the twins' lives, always respectful of boundaries, never presuming, but steadily building connections. He remembered Marcus's preference for apple juice over orange, knew that Maya needed the blue blanket when she was tired, understood which stories frightened and which delighted. One evening during dinner, Maya studied Alexander with unusual intensity, her small head tilted in consideration. "Why do your eyes look exactly like Marcus's?" she asked suddenly, the innocent question dropping into conversation like a stone into still water. Alexander froze, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. His gaze darted to Natasha, silently seeking direction. Before she could respond, Marcus leaned forward in his chair, examining Alexander's face with newfound curiosity. "And why do you have the same dimple that I do when you smile?" The moment Natasha had both dreaded and anticipated had arrived, forced by the perceptive observations of 4-year-olds who had begun connecting dots adults thought invisible to them. "Children," she began carefully, Let's finish dinner first. Then we'll talk in the sitting room, all of us." The 20 minutes that followed were among the longest of Natasha's life, each bite mechanical as she rehearsed words in her mind. When they finally settled in the sitting room, twins on the plush carpet, adults perched tensely on the sofa, she took a steadying breath. "Alexander is—" She hesitated, searching their innocent faces. "He's your father. He was sick and away for a long time." The words hung in the air, monumental yet somehow inadequate for the moment's gravity. Maya's eyes widened while Marcus grew unusually still, processing this revelation with characteristic thoughtfulness. "But," Maya frowned, direct as always, "why didn't you come see us before? Mama said we didn't know where you were." Alexander swallowed visibly, his knuckles white where he gripped his knee. Natasha expected evasion, a simplified explanation that would protect his image in their eyes. Instead, his honesty surprised her. "I made mistakes that hurt your mother," he said quietly. "Mistakes I regret every day. I wasn't brave enough to do what was right, and by the time I tried to fix things, I couldn't find you." "Were you really sick?" Marcus asked, his voice small. "Yes." Alexander touched his scarred cheek unconsciously. "I was in an accident and had to get better before I could look for you and your mom." Silence fell as the twins absorbed this information, exchanging those mysterious glances that suggested their private twin communication. Finally, Marcus spoke again, asking the question that revealed his deepest fear. "Are you going to go away again?" Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "Not if you'll let me stay in your lives. I've missed so much already. I don't want to miss another day." Maya approached him cautiously, examining his face with an intensity beyond her years. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she reached out to touch the scar on his cheek with gentle fingers. "Does it still hurt?" "Not anymore," Alexander whispered, though Natasha suspected he wasn't referring to the physical scar. That night, as she tucked the twins into bed, their questions continued, innocent inquiries that revealed the gaps in their young lives they had been more aware of than she realized. "Will Daddy read us stories sometimes too?" Maya asked, the title Daddy already adopted with the easy acceptance of childhood. "If you want him to," Natasha answered carefully. "Tommy at school has a daddy who teaches him baseball," Marcus observed thoughtfully. "Maybe our daddy could teach me chess more." As their breathing eventually deepened into sleep, Natasha stood in their doorway, watching their peaceful faces. She had believed that keeping Alexander separate from their lives was protection. Now she wondered if she had been protecting them or her own wounded heart. That night, alone in her room, Natasha didn't imagine that the small culinary segment she would film the following month would be seen by the Senator William Huntington, initiating a storm that would threaten everything they had begun to build. That night, alone in her room, Natasha didn't imagine that the small culinary segment she would film the following month would be seen by the Senator William Huntington, initiating a storm that would threaten everything they had begun to build. 6 months passed with the changing seasons, transforming Oakwood as surely as it transformed its inhabitants. Winter's stark branches gave way to spring buds, then summer's full bloom, marking the passage of time as a new family dynamic tentatively took root. The twins, with children's remarkable adaptability, had embraced Alexander's presence in their lives with growing enthusiasm. Each morning now included eager questions about whether Daddy would join them for breakfast or be available for afternoon games in the garden. On a brilliant June morning, Natasha stood in Oakwood's professional kitchen, arranging fresh berries atop a perfectly executed crème pâtissière tart. Her fingers, once clumsy with basic pastry techniques, now moved with the confidence imparted by half a year of intensive culinary training. "That looks exquisite," came Alexander's voice from the doorway, "like something from a magazine cover." Natasha allowed herself a small smile. Chef Moreau would still find 3 flaws minimum. Chef Moreau doesn't know the difference between technical perfection and food made with heart. Alexander approached, maintaining the respectful distance that had characterized their careful interactions. "I wanted to show you something." He placed a folded newspaper on the counter beside her. The Boston Globe's food section featured a glowing review of a new restaurant, but Alexander pointed to a smaller article at the bottom of the page. "Rising star takes first prize in regional culinary competition," Natasha read aloud, her eyes widening as she recognized her own name in the text. Natasha Williams, representing Le Cordon Bleu Boston, impressed judges with her innovative fusion of Caribbean and French techniques. "They published it," Alexander said, his voice warm with pride. "Your first recognition in print." Natasha traced her finger over the words, remembering the intense concentration required to perfect her competition dish, a reinterpretation of coco vin using Jamaican spices and techniques her mother had taught her years ago. "There's more," Alexander continued, visibly excited. "Chef Bernard from Maison wants to offer you an apprenticeship. It would be evenings, twice weekly, working directly under him." Natasha's breath caught. Maison was one of Boston's most acclaimed restaurants, boasting 2 Michelin stars and a months-long waiting list. How did he even know about me? "He was a guest judge at the competition," said he's rarely seen such intuitive understanding of flavor complexity. Alexander hesitated. "I told him you'd consider it. The schedule would work around your classes and our family time." Our family time. The phrase hung between them, neither acknowledged nor rejected. The careful dance of the past months had brought them to this tentative place, not quite reconciled, not quite separate. 3 days later, Natasha met with Chef Bernard, a formidable Frenchman whose reputation for perfectionism struck fear into established professionals. To her surprise, he greeted her with unexpected warmth. "Ms. Williams, your coriander-scented reduction was the most interesting thing I've tasted in months," he declared without preamble. "You have something that cannot be taught, a voice through food. I want that voice in my kitchen." The following week brought another unexpected opportunity. A producer from Local Flavors, a regional cooking program, approached Natasha after class. "We're looking to diversify our weekly segments," the young woman explained. "Your background and approach to fusion cuisine is exactly what our viewers want to see. One 10-minute segment each week, featuring accessible versions of your competition dishes." Life accelerated with dizzying speed. Between classes, the apprenticeship, and now television appearances, Natasha barely had time to process the rapid transformation of her circumstances. Only 6 months earlier, she had been a line cook with limited prospects. Now, industry professionals were using words like innovative and visionary to describe her cooking. For her television debut, the twins and Alexander came to the studio, watching proudly from behind the cameras as Natasha demonstrated her signature jerk-spiced scallops with citrus beurre blanc. Despite initial nervousness, she found herself relaxing on camera, sharing stories of how her mother's Jamaican cooking had influenced her approach to French techniques. "You were amazing," Alexander told her afterward, as they walked through the parking lot, the twins skipping ahead. "So natural, so confident." "It felt good," Natasha admitted, "sharing food stories that matter to me." A photographer from a local food blog approached them, camera already raised. "Ms. Williams, could I get a quick family photo for our Rising Stars feature?" Before Natasha could object, the twins had positioned themselves automatically. Maya on her right, Marcus on her left, with Alexander completing the family circle. The camera clicked several times, capturing a moment of unguarded happiness. The photo appeared online the next morning, Natasha radiant in her chef's whites, the twins beaming and Alexander looking at all three with unmistakable pride. The caption read, "Boston's newest culinary talent celebrates with family after successful TV debut." It was this image, innocently shared across social media, that eventually made its way to the imposing mahogany desk of Senator William Huntington. 2 weeks later, an elegantly addressed envelope arrived at Oakwood. Inside was an invitation to Natasha, not Alexander, requesting her presence at the exclusive Somerset Club for a private luncheon with an admirer of her culinary talents. "It's him," Alexander said flatly when she showed him the invitation. "My father never does anything directly. He sends surrogates, creates situations where he appears to be doing one thing while accomplishing another. Then I shouldn't go." "No," Alexander said after a moment's thought. "Perhaps you should. On your terms, not his. It's time we knew what he's planning." The Somerset Club embodied old Boston money, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced founders, hushed conversations between power brokers. Natasha, dressed in a simple but elegant dress purchased with her first television appearance fee, felt every eye follow her as the maitre d' led her to a private dining room. The woman waiting there was not Senator Huntington, but Victoria Chambers, Alexander's former fiancée, impeccably dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than Natasha's entire wardrobe. "Ms. Williams," Victoria greeted her with a cold smile. "How lovely to finally meet Alexander's cook." "Ms. Chambers," Natasha replied evenly. "I was expecting Senator Huntington. The senator sends his regrets. He thought a woman-to-woman chat might be more productive." Victoria gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please sit. The crab soufflé here is divine, though perhaps not up to your exacting standards." Throughout the exquisitely uncomfortable meal that followed, Victoria maintained a veneer of politeness while delivering carefully crafted barbs. "So it's true," she finally said, setting down her dessert fork. "The poor Alexander, captured by his personal chef and her convenient children." Natasha placed her napkin beside her plate, her expression controlled. "Is there a purpose to this meeting beyond insults?" Victoria's smile tightened. "The senator remains deeply concerned about his son's well-being. He'd be fascinated to learn more details about your domestic arrangement. There's nothing to tell that isn't already public knowledge. Isn't there?" Victoria withdrew her phone, displaying the family photo from outside the studio. "The senator has connections with every major culinary institution and media outlet in Massachusetts. One word from him, and your rising star could suddenly dim." Before Natasha could respond, the dining room door opened abruptly. Alexander stood there, leaning on his cane, his expression thunderous. "That's enough, Victoria," he said coldly. "You've delivered your threat. Now leave." Victoria's composure faltered momentarily. "Alexander, what a surprise. I was just getting acquainted with your household staff. You can tell my father that his days of manipulating my life are over." Alexander's voice was level but dangerous. "You can leave voluntarily, or I will have you removed." After Victoria's departure, Alexander drove Natasha back to Oakwood in tense silence. "I'm sorry," he finally said. "I should have anticipated he'd send her." That night, unable to sleep, Natasha paced her kitchen, the confrontation with Victoria replaying in her mind. The implied threats against her career should have terrified her. Instead, they ignited something fierce and determined. By morning, she had created an entirely new dish for her upcoming competition, a complex, multi-layered creation she named Caribbean Rebirth, featuring ingredients that symbolized resilience and transformation. On the competition stage, her hands trembled slightly as she plated her final creation, but her face revealed only focused concentration. The judges approached her station last, having tasted 9 other competitors' offerings. "This is remarkable," the head judge said after a long, contemplative bite. "The layering of flavors, the contrasting textures. I've never tasted anything quite like it." When they announced her as the winner, cameras flashed as she accepted the trophy, momentarily dazed by the sudden applause. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" a reporter asked during her first impromptu interview. "Life," Natasha answered simply, "and determination." Returning to Oakwood that evening, trophy in hand, she found the twins and Alexander waiting with a homemade celebration cake, decorated with uneven frosting and too many sprinkles. clearly the children's work. While cutting the celebration cake, Natasha didn't notice that the small article about her victory in a local newspaper would be seen by Senator William Huntington, initiating a storm that would threaten everything they had built. While cutting the celebration cake, Natasha didn't notice that the small article about her victory in a local newspaper would be seen by Senator William Huntington, initiating a storm that would threaten everything they had built. The morning after her competition victory, Natasha awoke to her phone buzzing with notifications. Her inbox overflowed with congratulatory messages, but more surprisingly, interview requests from several local publications. The Boston Herald wanted her recipe. The Food Network had emailed about a potential guest appearance. Even Bon Appetit magazine expressed interest in her unique cultural fusion approach. "You've become quite the culinary celebrity overnight," Alexander commented, sliding a cup of coffee across the kitchen island to her. The twins were still asleep, giving them a rare moment of adult conversation. "It's just local interest," Natasha demurred, though she couldn't suppress the small thrill of professional recognition. "It will pass." Alexander's smile was warm with genuine pride. "I don't think so. Not this time." He was right. Within a week, Chef Bernard had increased her apprenticeship hours, moving her from prep work to actual line cooking during service. Her segment on local flavors expanded from 10 minutes to a full half hour. The producers delighted with the audience response to her first appearance. "We've never had this many calls after a debut segment," the producer explained, showing Natasha the viewing metrics. "People connect with your story. Single mother, immigrant background, classical training but with your own twist. It's exactly what cooking shows have been missing." The review in the Boston Globe food section called her the new star of the regional gastronomy scene and praised her ability to combine technical precision with soul-stirring flavors that tell a story on each plate. Each success felt like a vindication, each compliment erasing a small piece of the dismissive words Alexander had once thrown at her. A waitress without formal education, a burden to the Huntington legacy. Now culinary professionals sought her opinions, students at Le Cordon Bleu asked for her advice, and viewers wrote to share how her recipes had brought their families together. After her third television appearance, a sleek black town car waited outside the studio. The driver presented Natasha with an embossed business card. "James Bennett, Executive Chef, The Willows. I would be honored to discuss potential collaboration." The Willows was Boston's most exclusive restaurant, a Michelin-starred establishment where politicians and celebrities dined in discreet private rooms. James Bennett, renowned for his exacting standards and innovative tasting menus, rarely took on protégés. The following afternoon, Natasha toured the Willows' immaculate kitchen, mesmerized by the choreographed precision of the staff during pre-service preparations. "I've been watching your development with interest," Chef Bennett said, leading her through the various stations. "Your competition dish showed remarkable imagination. We could use that perspective here, perhaps initially for our seasonal tasting menu." Natasha struggled to maintain professional composure. "Are you offering me a position?" "An apprenticeship leading to sous chef, conditional on completing your formal training. 6 months probation, then we reassess." His expression remained impassive, but his eyes were kind. "Your children would be welcome at our staff meals. We understand work-life balance here." Walking back to her car, Natasha felt lightheaded with possibility. From abandoned and penniless to courted by one of Boston's culinary legends in just over 4 years. If only Alexander could have seen her potential then, instead of discarding her as an inconvenient complication. At Oakwood that evening, she shared the news with Alexander, who immediately opened champagne in celebration. "This is extraordinary," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Bennett rarely takes on new talent. He must have been incredibly impressed." Before she could respond, her phone rang, the local flavors producer with more unexpected news. "The network loves you," the woman gushed. "They want to expand your segment into a weekly half-hour show. Caribbean fusion with Natasha Williams. We'd film on Thursdays, air on Sundays. The contract's being drafted now." The twins were ecstatic about their mother's television show, proudly telling everyone at school. Alexander arranged his schedule to care for them during Thursday filming sessions, becoming the steady parental presence Natasha had never dared hope for. Life developed a pleasant rhythm: culinary school in the mornings, television filming 1 day a week, apprenticeship hours at the Willows in the evenings, and precious family time in between. The guest house at Oakwood no longer felt temporary but had become a true home, filled with children's laughter and the aromas of experimental dishes. One Thursday afternoon, Alexander and the twins waited in the studio audience, watching proudly as Natasha demonstrated her grandmother's technique for perfect rice and peas. The cameraman captured a quick shot of them applauding enthusiastically, including it in the episode's final cut. That brief family moment, broadcast across Massachusetts, would prove to be their undoing. 2 days later, Natasha received a perplexing call from Chef Bennett. "I'm terribly sorry, Natasha, but we need to postpone your apprenticeship. Some unexpected staffing issues have arisen. Perhaps next semester would be better." His voice carried genuine regret, but something felt off about the sudden reversal. Before she could process this disappointment, her phone rang again. The local Flavors producer, suddenly awkward and evasive. "There's been a change of plans with the network," she explained haltingly. "Our sponsors are concerned about certain aspects of your personal situation. Nothing I agree with, of course, but they hold the purse strings." Alexander's face darkened when Natasha related these conversations later that evening. "This isn't coincidence," he said grimly. "Let me make some calls." His suspicions proved correct. A substantial donation from the Huntington Family Foundation had been made to the Willows charitable program the day before Chef Bennett's call. Similar donations had appeared in the television network's corporate giving records. "My father is systematic," Alexander explained, scrolling through financial records on his laptop. "He identifies leverage points and applies pressure precisely where it will cause maximum impact." As if to confirm his assessment, the twins came home from school the next day with confused expressions. "Tommy's mom said I can't come to his birthday party anymore," Marcus reported sadly. "She said his grandpa doesn't want Huntingtons there." Maya's lower lip trembled. "And Sophia's mom canceled our playdate too." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. He's extending the pressure to the children now. This is exactly his pattern. Isolate, then offer a solution to the isolation he created. As predicted, an elegant cream envelope arrived the following morning, addressed to Alexander. Inside was a formal invitation to the annual Huntington Foundation Gala, traditionally attended by Boston's elite: politicians, business leaders, old money families maintaining appearances and alliances. "You're expected to attend solo, as always," Alexander read from the accompanying note. "Your father looks forward to discussing your return to the family business." Natasha studied his face, the familiar features now shadowed with anger and resolve. "What will you do?" "What I should have done 4 years ago." Alexander's voice was quiet, but determined. "Stand up to him. Publicly." That evening, they retreated to the library, spreading across the massive desk all the evidence Alexander had accumulated over years: photographs documenting surveillance, transcripts of threats, financial records showing punitive actions against anyone who defied William Huntington's will. "We have enough to expose him," Alexander said, organizing documents into folders. "His manipulation, the systematic isolation, possibly even evidence suggesting he orchestrated my accident." "Where would we even begin?" Natasha asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the senator's influence. Alexander held up the invitation. "We'll confront him where he can't silence us, in front of everyone who matters to him." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of attending the gala alone as instructed, Alexander would officially register Natasha and the twins as his guests, bringing them directly into the lion's den. The Huntington Foundation Gala was too public, too filled with witnesses and media for the senator to risk an ugly scene. "Are you sure about this?" Natasha asked. thinking of the twins. "It will change everything." "I'm counting on it," Alexander replied, his expression resolute. "We've been reactive long enough, allowing him to dictate the terms of our lives. It's time we took control of our own narrative." The following week brought frantic preparations. A friend from culinary school helped Natasha select an appropriate gown, simple but elegant, borrowed rather than purchased. The twins received basic coaching on formal event behavior, excited by the prospect of their first fancy party. On the night of the gala, Natasha stood before the mirror in her borrowed midnight blue dress, hardly recognizing the confident woman who gazed back. 4 years ago, she had been a pregnant, abandoned waitress, discarded as unworthy of the Huntington name. Now she was about to walk into the heart of Huntington territory, not as a supplicant, but as an equal with achievements of her own. Alexander appeared in the doorway, handsome in his tuxedo despite the cane he still required. His eyes softened as he took in her appearance. "You look beautiful." "I'm terrified," she admitted, adjusting a borrowed silver bracelet. "So am I," he confessed, "but not of him anymore. I'm afraid of failing you and the children again." As they helped the twins into the car, excitement temporarily overshadowing the gravity of their mission, Natasha didn't know that before the night ended, not only would the Huntington Empire be at stake, but her own vision of justice and forgiveness would be profoundly challenged. As they helped the twins into the car, excitement temporarily overshadowing the gravity of their mission, Natasha felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced years ago when entering the beacon during Alexander's family dinners. Then, she had been invisible, a server in the background. Tonight, she would be seen. The drive to the Huntington Foundation Gala passed in silence, the Boston skyline glittering against the night sky. Alexander reached across the seat to squeeze her hand, his touch anchoring her to the present rather than the painful past. "Remember," he said quietly as the car approached the venue, "my father will try to control the narrative. He always does." The Rosewood Hotel ballroom glowed with understated opulence, crystal chandeliers, arrangements of white roses, Boston's elite in designer evening wear exchanging air kisses and calculated compliments. A string quartet played softly in one corner, providing elegant background music for networking disguised as philanthropy. When their car pulled up to the entrance, photographers immediately recognized Alexander, cameras raised in anticipation of the Huntington heir's arrival. Their professional smiles faltered in confusion as Alexander emerged with a cane, then offered his hand to Natasha. When the twins followed, the flashes intensified, capturing the unexpected family unit. "Mr. Huntington, who are your guests?" called one photographer. "Is this an official appearance with your family?" asked another. Alexander smiled tightly, placing a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Yes, this is my family." The statement, simple yet revolutionary in the context of Huntington traditions, elicited an immediate ripple of whispers among the waiting guests. As they approached the check-in table, the coordinator's practiced smile froze. "Mr. Huntington, we weren't expecting additional guests from your household." "I registered 4 guests 2 days ago," Alexander replied firmly. "Natasha Williams and Marcus and Maya Williams Huntington." The woman glanced nervously toward the ballroom interior. "There seems to be some confusion. Your traditional place setting is at the head table, but it's—" "Then we'll need 3 additional settings at the head table," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "Or the 4 of us will be happy to dine elsewhere." Inside, the reaction to their entrance was immediate. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Victoria Chambers, resplendent in scarlet Valentino, actually dropped her flute, the shattering crystal creating a momentary distraction. "Daddy, everyone's staring," Maya whispered, pressing closer to Alexander's side. "That's because you both look so wonderful," he answered, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. They've never seen such elegant children at a boring adult party. As they moved through the crowd, Natasha felt the weight of evaluating gazes, some curious, others openly hostile. Her borrowed dress suddenly felt conspicuous next to the designer gowns surrounding them, but she lifted her chin, remembering the words Chef Moreau had spoken during a particularly challenging class. It is not the knife that makes the chef, but the hand that holds it. Across the ballroom, standing on a small stage beside the podium, Senator William Huntington was engaged in conversation with the mayor. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, tall, silver-haired, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. When an aide whispered urgently in his ear, his head turned sharply, eyes narrowing as they found Alexander leading his unexpected family directly toward the head table. "I see him," Marcus said, spotting the senator first. "Is that our grandfather?" The innocent question carried across the suddenly hushed area surrounding them. Alexander squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "Yes, that's him." The senator's expression shifted through a remarkable series of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, a practiced political smile that never reached his cold eyes. He descended from the stage with deliberate steps, intercepting them before they could reach the head table. "Alexander," he greeted, voice perfectly modulated to carry just far enough. "What an unexpected surprise. I had assumed you would observe the traditional protocols for this event." "Times change, Father," Alexander replied. "May I introduce you to my family? This is Natasha Williams, and these are your grandchildren, Marcus and Maya." The senator's smile tightened fractionally. "Perhaps we should continue this reunion in a more private setting." "I don't think so," Alexander countered. "We've had enough privacy and secrets in this family. Too many, in fact." Around them, guests pretended not to listen while straining to catch every word. Several had already withdrawn phones, discreetly recording the unprecedented confrontation. The senator placed a firm hand on Alexander's shoulder, attempting to guide him away from the center of attention. "Son, you're clearly still affected by your accident. Let's not create a scene that we'll all regret." Alexander removed his father's hand. "The only thing I regret is not standing up to you sooner." With practiced ease, the senator raised his voice slightly, addressing nearby guests. "Please excuse us. My son's medication sometimes affects his judgment. Security will escort him and his guests to my private office." At his subtle gesture, two men in dark suits approached from opposite sides of the room. "That won't be necessary," came an authoritative voice from behind them. Judge Eleanor Reynolds, head of the First Circuit Court, stepped forward. "Senator, I believe your son and his family are here as legitimate guests, unless you're suggesting otherwise." The senator's face betrayed nothing, but Natasha saw the calculation in his eyes, weighing the consequences of confrontation against the cost of acquiescence. "Of course they're welcome," he finally said, voice honeyed with false warmth. "Family is the foundation of everything we do, as tonight's gala celebrates." Judge Reynolds nodded slightly. "Excellent. Then perhaps we should all proceed to our tables. I believe the program is about to begin." As the senator turned toward the stage, clearly intending to regain control of the situation, Maya tugged at Natasha's hand. The excitement of the evening had given way to overstimulation, and tears pooled in her eyes. "Mama, it's too loud," she whispered, lower lip trembling. The senator paused, his gaze falling on his granddaughter for the first time with genuine attention. Something flickered across his expression, a momentary softening as he took in Maya's features, so reminiscent of Alexander's mother, his late wife. For a heartbeat, the mighty Senator Huntington was simply a man looking at a child who carried his bloodline, a living connection to the woman he had lost. His hand, adorned with the Huntington signet ring, twitched slightly, as if he might reach toward her. Natasha instinctively moved to comfort Maya, crouching to eye level despite the formal setting. "It's okay, sweetheart. We can step outside for a moment if you need quiet." The tenderness of the interaction seemed to affect the senator more than any confrontation could have. He watched Natasha gently wipe away Maya's tears, murmuring reassurances that immediately calmed the child. "She has Elizabeth's eyes," he said, so quietly that only Alexander heard him, referring to his late wife. The moment of vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The senator straightened, political mask firmly back in place. "The head table can accommodate 4 more settings. I'll have the staff arrange it immediately." As he strode away, Alexander exchanged a meaningful glance with Natasha. The first battle had been engaged, with an unexpected glimpse of potential weakness in their opponent. "Did you see that?" Alexander whispered as they followed the senator toward the head table. "When he looked at Maya?" "I saw," Natasha confirmed. "Even the mighty Senator Huntington has a heart somewhere beneath all that power." With hundreds of influential witnesses observing the scene, Natasha couldn't imagine that before the evening ended, not only would the Huntington Empire be at stake, but her own vision of justice and forgiveness would be profoundly challenged. With hundreds of influential witnesses observing the scene, Natasha couldn't imagine that before the evening ended, not only would the Huntington Empire be at stake, but her own vision of justice and forgiveness would be profoundly challenged. The head table at the Huntington Foundation Gala had become the epicenter of tension, an invisible battlefield where decades of power dynamics were being silently renegotiated with each passing minute. Waiters scurried to add place settings, their practiced efficiency momentarily disrupted by the unexpected change in protocol. Senator William Huntington took his place at the center, commanding the table with the ease of a general. On his left sat Alexander, then Natasha and the twins, their presence a visible disruption to the established order. To the senator's right were the expected dignitaries, the mayor, a federal judge, and several major donors whose fortunes were intertwined with Huntington influence. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senator began, rising to address the gathered elite once the initial courses had been served. "Welcome to the 35th Annual Huntington Foundation Gala. Tonight, we celebrate our continued commitment to Boston's future." His voice carried the practiced cadence of decades in politics, each word precisely weighted. If the unexpected presence of his grandchildren and their mother disturbed him, his public persona revealed nothing. "As many of you know," he continued, "the Huntington legacy is built on tradition, on values that stand the test of time." Alexander's fingers tightened around his water glass. Beside him, Natasha felt the twins growing restless with the formality of the event. Maya's small hand crept into hers beneath the table, seeking reassurance. As the senator launched into his prepared remarks about philanthropic initiatives and community leadership, Alexander leaned closer to Natasha. "He's trying to regain control of the narrative," he whispered, "pretending this is all normal. That's his strategy when caught off guard." The senator concluded his welcome to enthusiastic applause, then gestured toward a side entrance. "And now I believe our security team has an announcement regarding seating arrangements for the remainder of the evening." 2 men in dark suits appeared, moving with purpose toward their table. Alexander straightened, recognizing the calculated move. "He's having us removed," he murmured to Natasha, "creating a minor disruption now to avoid a major one later." Before the security personnel could reach them, Alexander stood, supporting himself on his cane. "Actually, Father, before we proceed with the evening's formalities, I believe there are introductions that should be made properly." The room stilled. 200 of Boston's most influential citizens suddenly alert to the undercurrent of confrontation. "Alexander," the senator's voice carried a warning wrapped in a smile. "This is hardly the appropriate venue for personal matters." "On the contrary," Alexander replied, voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "The Huntington Foundation celebrates family values, does it not? What could be more appropriate than acknowledging all members of the family?" He turned to address the room directly. "For those who haven't had the pleasure of meeting them, these are my children, Marcus and Maya Williams Huntington, and their mother, Natasha Williams, whose culinary talents some of you may have recently discovered through her television appearances. The senator's face remained impassive, but Natasha caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He signaled more urgently to the security team. "I believe my son is unwell," he announced smoothly. "Perhaps we should continue this family reunion in private." Alexander reached into his jacket, withdrawing an envelope. "Before anyone is escorted anywhere, I think the Huntington Foundation's donors might be interested in how their contributions are sometimes utilized." He began distributing photographs and documents, surveillance images of Natasha during her pregnancy, financial records showing systematic pressure applied to her former employers, transcripts of threats. "4 years ago, when I informed my father that I intended to marry Natasha, these were his methods of persuasion," Alexander stated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Threats against her immigrant parents, economic blacklisting, and when I finally confronted him about it 2 years ago, I suffered an accident that nearly killed me." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. The senator's political smile never wavered, though something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "My son has been troubled since his accident," he said, addressing the room with practiced concern. "Traumatic brain injuries can cause paranoia, confusion." "Is this confusion, Father?" Alexander held up a recording device. "Your conversation with the mechanic who tampered with my car? Or perhaps the documented threats against Natasha's family?" Victoria Chambers rose from a nearby table, her scarlet dress a slash of color as she moved to the senator's side. "William, control your son before he destroys everything we've built." Her intervention proved catastrophic. Alexander pressed play on the device and Victoria's voice filled the ballroom. "The Jamaica problem has been handled. He'll never find her once we're done." Security personnel hesitated, looking to the senator for direction. One moved forward, reaching for Alexander's arm. "I wouldn't," came the authoritative voice of Judge Reynolds, rising from her seat. "Those appear to be evidence of several federal crimes. Tampering with them now would constitute obstruction of justice." The tension in the room thickened as power structures visibly realigned. Several guests discreetly captured the confrontation on phones. Others whispered urgently into Bluetooth devices, alerting absent partners or legal counsel. Maya, overwhelmed by the adult's intensity, began to cry softly, burying her face against Natasha's side. The sound, childlike, vulnerable, innocent, cut through the political theater like a knife. The senator's gaze snapped to his granddaughter, something complex passing across his features. For a brief moment, his mask slipped, revealing not the calculating politician but an aging man confronted with the human cost of his machinations. Natasha gathered Maya into her arms, whispering comforting words. As she soothed her daughter, she became aware of the senator watching them, his expression unreadable, yet somehow altered. What happened next surprised everyone, Natasha most of all. She stood, Maya still in her arms, and addressed the senator directly. "Your grandchildren deserve to know all parts of their heritage," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the silent room. "Including you." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests. This wasn't the vindictive confrontation they'd anticipated, but something more complex. "All we've ever wanted was acknowledgement," Natasha continued. "Not your money or influence, but recognition that these children exist and matter. They carry your blood, your name, your legacy, whether that's officially recognized or not." The senator remained silent, his gaze never leaving Maya's tear-streaked face. "You can admit your mistakes," Natasha said. "Accept your family publicly, and we can find a way forward that honors these children's right to know their complete heritage." The ballroom held its collective breath, hundreds of influential Bostonians witnessing a negotiation more consequential than any political deal brokered in backrooms. At stake was not merely the Huntington reputation, but a fundamental reckoning with truth and consequences. Senator William Huntington stood at the crossroads of his carefully constructed life. Decades of power and influence balanced against the simple, devastating fact of his grandchildren's existence. His reputation, his legacy, his carefully cultivated image, all hung in the balance of his next words. Marcus, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke, his young voice carrying with unexpected clarity, "Are you really our grandfather?" The direct question from the boy, so like Alexander in appearance, seemed to penetrate the senator's defenses in a way that threats and evidence could not. For the first time, he looked directly at his grandson, taking in the familiar blue eyes, the determined chin, the unmistakable Huntington bearing already evident in the child's posture. The ballroom remained silent, everyone waiting for the powerful senator's response. Natasha held Maya closer, Alexander moved protectively toward Marcus, and in that moment of suspended tension, no one could predict that in less than a year, the mansion Oakwood would host a ceremony that would not only unite a divided family but also launch the most unlikely culinary empire Boston had ever seen. The ballroom remained silent, everyone waiting for the powerful senator's response. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Senator William Huntington stood perfectly still, a man accustomed to controlling rooms now finding himself at the mercy of a simple question from a 4-year-old boy. 6 months later, that frozen tableau seemed like another lifetime. The headlines that followed the gala had been merciless. Huntington family drama explodes at charity event. Senator's secret grandchildren revealed. Power, privilege, and paternity. The Huntington scandal. The morning after the confrontation, Senator William Huntington had called an unexpected press conference. Political analysts predicted damage control, denial, perhaps character assassination of the woman who had challenged one of Massachusetts' most powerful men. Instead, Boston witnessed something unprecedented. Standing at the podium without notes, the senator had announced his immediate retirement from politics, citing family priorities that I have neglected for too long. The carefully crafted statement acknowledged his grandchildren publicly and expressed regret for decisions made in the misguided belief that I was protecting the Huntington legacy. Now, on a crisp autumn day, Natasha stood in Oakwood's kitchen, arranging flowers for the dining table while watching through the window as Marcus explained the rules of his invented game to his grandfather. The senator, now simply William to the family, sat on a garden bench, listening with the intense concentration he had once reserved for legislative debates. "It's still strange, isn't it?" Alexander's voice came from behind her. "Seeing them together." Natasha nodded, adjusting a lily in the arrangement. "Sometimes I think I'm dreaming all of this." The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. Following the gala, weeks of cautious negotiation had ensued. Lawyers, therapists, carefully structured initial visits between the senator and the twins. Natasha had insisted on being present for every interaction, watching like a hawk for any sign of manipulation or conditional affection. "Do you trust him yet?" Alexander asked, voicing the question that lingered between them. "I trust that he loves them," Natasha answered thoughtfully. "Whether I trust him completely, that's still evolving." The first supervised visit had been awkward, the mighty senator appearing almost timid as he offered carefully chosen presents to the twins. Maya, with her characteristic directness, had asked the question adults had danced around. "You were mean to Mama. Now will you be good?" William's response had surprised them all. Kneeling to her level despite his arthritic knees, he had answered with unexpected humility, "I'm learning to be better if you'll give me that chance." In the kitchen, Alexander unrolled architectural plans across the countertop, anchoring the corners with spice jars. "The contractor says we can break ground next month if the permits come through." Natasha studied the blueprints for what would become her restaurant, not the small neighborhood cafe she had once dreamed of, but an ambitious culinary training center in South Boston. "Not a restaurant alone," she had explained when first outlining her vision, "but a place where women like I was, talented, struggling, needing just one chance, can learn professional skills while earning a living wage. Alexander had embraced the concept immediately, offering financial backing without hesitation. More surprising had been William's intervention, arriving at Oakwood one evening with a portfolio of potential corporate sponsors. "I might as well use my connections for something worthwhile," he had said gruffly, uncomfortable with their surprise. The Huntington name should stand for more than power politics. Now, examining the finalized plans, Natasha felt the familiar mixture of excitement and disbelief that had characterized these past months. From abandoned waitress to culinary entrepreneur, from solitary mother to head of a reconstructed family, the journey seemed impossible even as she lived it. "The first class could start next summer," she said, tracing the training kitchen layout with her fingertip. 6 students initially, expanding to 12 by year 2. Outside, Maya had joined her brother and grandfather, presenting William with a flower crown she had woven. With solemn dignity, the former senator allowed her to place it atop his silver hair, his expression softening in a way that would have shocked his political colleagues. That evening, as Natasha stood before her closet selecting an outfit, her hand hesitated between options. Tomorrow would mark another milestone, her marriage to Alexander in a small ceremony on Oakwood's grounds. "Nothing too elaborate," she had insisted when planning began. "We don't need extravagance to celebrate true love." The dress she chose was simple but elegant, ivory silk that skimmed her figure, embellished only with subtle beading along the neckline. No massive train, no ostentatious veil, nothing that spoke of proving worth through expense. When Alexander saw her the next morning, helping Maya arrange flowers in her hair, his expression confirmed she had chosen correctly. "You're breathtaking," he said simply. The ceremony itself reflected their journey, intimate rather than imposing, meaningful rather than showy. The gardens had been decorated with flowers grown on the property, tables set with simple elegance, lighting provided by handmade candles the twins had crafted in school. Maya took her role as flower girl with characteristic seriousness, carefully measuring each petal dropped along the path. Marcus carried the rings with exaggerated care, his small face solemn with responsibility. William Huntington sat in a discreet position among the small gathering of guests, culinary school friends, teachers, chefs who had mentored Natasha, a few of Alexander's trusted colleagues. His presence, still slightly uncomfortable but determined, symbolized how profoundly the family landscape had shifted. When it came time for vows, Alexander spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You taught me that true family is built with courage, not with name or fortune. You showed me that love isn't about grand gestures, but about showing up every day, especially when it's difficult. I promise to be the man you and our children deserve, not perfect, but present, honest, and entirely yours." Natasha's vows acknowledged their complex journey. "We've learned that even broken ingredients, when combined with genuine love and respect, create the most nutritious recipe for life. I promise to continue building this family with you, not based on what others expect, but on what we know matters: truth, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again." 1 year later, a line of customers stretched down the block outside Heritage, Natasha's restaurant and culinary training center. Inside, 6 women, all single mothers with culinary aspirations, worked alongside professional chefs, creating dishes that told stories of cultural blending and personal transformation. Critics had been unanimous in their praise. Williams Huntington doesn't merely feed her guests, she offers them a journey through memory, identity, and possibility. Each dish carries a narrative of resilience. In the private dining room, reserved that evening for family, Natasha surveyed the scene with quiet satisfaction. Maya and Marcus, now 5, helped fold napkins into elaborate shapes they'd learned from Mrs. Hartford. Alexander discussed sustainable farming practices with a local supplier, and William, still adjusting to his role as grandfather rather than senator, awkwardly but earnestly attempted to learn napkin folding from his grandchildren. After the restaurant closed, the family gathered in the teaching kitchen. It had become a tradition. Sunday night cooking lessons where Natasha shared techniques with the twins, while Alexander and increasingly William assisted. "Today we're making Jamaican patties," Natasha announced, helping the children don their miniature aprons. "My grandmother's recipe, with a few French techniques added." As she guided small hands through the process of making dough, Natasha caught Alexander watching her, his expression soft with something that looked remarkably like wonder. Later, as they closed the restaurant together, Natasha paused to look at her family gathered in the kitchen, the twins, Alexander, and even William, now transformed, and finally understood the truth her dishes told each customer, that abandonment, when slowly cooked with determination, forgiveness, and courage, can transform into the most nutritious meal the heart will ever taste. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.